Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Wednesday everybody. First up, the big economic news from the last 24 hours is yet more disappointing trade data for the month of April. Yesterday, Tuesday, new customs data showed imports falling almost 8% in April year-on-year, a poor result well below expectations, and also well below the 1.4% decline seen a month earlier. Economists in a UK-based Reuters poll had projected flat import growth in April. Economists in a US-based Bloomberg poll had similar expectations, projecting a 0.2% contraction. Quote, at the beginning of this year, one would assume that imports will easily surpass 2022 levels following the reopening, but that hasn't been the case. End quote. Exports grew 8.5%, easing greatly from the 14.8% surge we saw back in March. China's trade surplus in April grew to more than $90 billion, from $88 billion in March, driven more by the plunge in imports than the slower export growth. The chief economist at Shanghai-based Guotai Junan International said that the import data were, quote, somewhat downbeat, end quote, which suggests, quote, slowing growth momentum in the second quarter, end quote. Capital Economics estimates that after adjusting for price changes and seasonality, export volumes actually fell 4.4% in April compared with March. Exports to the US fell by an annual 6.5%. State media pointed out that China's trade with Belt and Road countries jumped by 16% year-on-year. The drop in imports is yet another red flag, suggesting that China's much-needed consumption rebound is not as strong as policymakers had hoped. As for the exports slowdown, this is likely largely due to global economic and geopolitical instability. Quote, the global economy is deteriorating and will weaken China's manufacturing sector. It is looking more likely that, in response, the government will step in to support the manufacturing sector's labor market through fiscal stimulus. End quote. Indeed, this week Chinese iron ore prices dropped to their lowest levels in 5 months. Quote, as weak demand adds to evidence that the country's economic rebound from tough coronavirus lockdowns may be faltering. End quote, in the words of UK-based Financial Times. One Hong Kong-based trader expressed to the outlet this week, quote, the demand for steel has collapsed since the start of April, end quote, adding, quote, this is bad news, end quote. We remember that China's manufacturing activity saw a surprise contraction in April. The construction sector, which accounts for about half of Chinese steel demand, also saw slower growth, driven by a plunge in new housing investment. Next up, China has had a tough week on the diplomatic front. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. It's just me making these episodes every day. It's a lot of work, but your guys' support is a huge source of motivation. Subscribing and sharing is a huge help as well, and for those who can go the extra mile and help me keep the channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. PRC Foreign Minister Qin Gang is in Europe this week, and in Germany, matters got off to a bumpy start. It emerged on Monday that China cancelled a visit by Germany's finance minister to Beijing this week at the last minute. In Germany, Qin said that the short-notice cancellation of the visit was due to, quote, an urgent schedule change, end quote, by Chinese Finance Minister Liu Kun, and said the matter, quote, should not be overinterpreted, end quote. Perhaps this is the case, or perhaps the Foreign Ministry is once again playing cleanup for more powerful ministries which have reputations of acting without giving their foreign policy and diplomatic colleagues a heads up. Of course, we cannot know. But, as one analyst observed today, quote, unless something is going on with Liu, say he is being replaced, it is hard not to see the postponement as a snub. End quote. Meanwhile, Qin also warned Germany against the rumoured sanctions on PRC firms over sales to Russia, expressing that China would, quote, strictly and firmly defend the legitimate interests of our country and our companies, End quote. Multiple European media outlets are reporting that 8 Chinese businesses accused of selling equipment that could be used in weapons to the Russians have been listed in a new package of sanctions. Standing next to his German counterpart in Berlin, China's foreign minister added, quote, "There is a normal exchange and cooperation between Chinese and Russian companies. We are against states introducing extraterritorial or one-sided sanctions on China or any other country." End quote. US-based financial media outlet The Wall Street Journal observes that European capitals, especially Paris and Berlin, have forcefully opposed US extraterritorial sanctions for decades. Quote, "But amid the fight to isolate Russia's economy from Western goods, Europe is showing increased willingness to sanction non-EU firms that are supplying Russia with goods that Brussels has prevented its companies exporting." End quote. On the issue of Ukraine, Xinjiang expressed, quote, "As a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and responsible major country, China will neither watch the fire from the other bank nor add fuel to the fire. China is willing to maintain communication with relevant parties, including Germany, to achieve an early ceasefire." End quote. How are Chinese commentators discussing this EU trip specifically and China's EU policy generally? Quote, "As China's preparation to send a special envoy to Ukraine for mediation is almost complete, the leadership is making efforts to resolve the Ukraine crisis and get China-EU relations back on track." End quote. And, quote, "As power politics played out between Washington and Beijing, some EU countries would like to forge more autonomy for Europe, and a visit by China's foreign minister demonstrates endorsement of this goal." End quote. Full disclosure, Professor Jia was one of my professors for my master's program, though we didn't always agree on everything. Meanwhile, jumping across the Atlantic and also on the diplomatic front, Beijing has fired its first response to Canada's expulsion of PRC diplomat Zhao Wei for alleged interference in Canadian politics, which we discussed in yesterday's video, with the expulsion of a Shanghai-based Canadian diplomat. People's Republic of China Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin expressed, quote, "The Canadian government's ill-founded and erroneous action seriously harms the lawful rights and interests of Chinese diplomatic and consular personnel. China does not accept this. We will not waver in our resolve to uphold China's interests. We urge Canada to stop its provocation at once. If Canada decides to continue its wanton act, China will react firmly, and all consequences arising therefrom must be borne by Canada." End quote. The decision to expel the Canadian diplomat was a top trending topic on Chinese social media on Tuesday, with the most up-liked comment on Weibo at one point calling for China to expel more diplomats and shut down a consulate. Unsurprisingly, Chinese state media articles have also become more aggressive. Quote, "Canada appears to have become a leading anti-China force in the US-led small clique. Its China policy has become even more confrontational than that of Washington, which has dragged Canada-China relations into the deep freeze. The current anti-China waves across Canadian politics and public opinion could be seen as a Canadian version of McCarthyism in the 21st century. This witch-hunting move against Chinese Canadian politicians and voters based on groundless accusations could foster conditions for exclusion, hostility, and even persecution of people of Chinese descent by the whole Canadian society and people." End quote. Speaking to reporters in Ottawa yesterday, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau expressed, quote, "We understand there is retaliation, but we will not be intimidated. We will continue to do everything necessary to keep Canadians protected from foreign interference." End quote. Canadian media outlet The Globe and Mail is now reporting too, citing 2 unnamed government sources, that Canada is now seeking to join AUKUS, the security pact between Australia, Britain, and the United States, established to, quote, "counter China's rising military might in the Indo-Pacific region." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. I know the diplomatic stuff especially is getting quite heavy. Unfortunately, tomorrow's episode is probably going to be more heavy. For today, though, enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are, and I will see you all tomorrow.